Greetings. Just yesterday, Remy Ilona put out a video titled "Abraham's DNA Didn't Change, His Culture Changed and Became Omenana." And I felt it was warranted to offer some further discussion on this, to explore what he said in that video and perhaps critique it a bit, hence this video, which you're watching right now. And some of this discussion is going to have relevance to the Igbo Psaq from back in January of 2022, which was put out by the Obadyah Alliance, which I've explored in previous videos, and I'll link to those videos in the video description. And then other parts of this video are going to relate to the Yap Gang's review of Remy's claims and Remy's not-so-veiled attempts to push back on that video. So in the interest of brevity, let's jump right in. And the first clip that I want to look at is going to show how Remy opened his video, right? Starting at the very beginning. He stated that Rabbi Yehonatán Elazar-DeMota, produced a letter from nearly 2 centuries ago from a rabbinic authority in Europe, which was addressed to the Igbos and recognized them as children of Israel and as brothers, right? And this is interesting. So here's the clip and fair use.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. There was this letter written in 1841 by some London-based rabbis to the Igbo people. This letter was discovered so many years ago by Dr. Daniel Lees, the Swiss Israeli anthropologist who researched on the Igbo Jewish question. This letter was essentially saying that the Igbo people were brothers of the Jewish rabbis who wrote it. Today, I woke up to find this letter posted by another academic, Dr. Hakam Rabbi Dayan Yehonatán Elazar-DeMota, the president of Obadyah Alliance, the Sephardic Jewish institution that constituted a Bedin, that is a religious court, that ruled that based on every evidence available that the Igbo people that you identify with the modern country called Nigeria are lineal descendants of the biblical Israelites. He posted this letter on Facebook this morning.
Okay, now I imagine some who heard that felt that sounded rather impressive, and therefore I want to take a look at the Facebook post which Remy was referring to. Rabbi DeMota wrote the following in his caption, quote, "A letter written by Hacham David de Raphael Meldola of London on the 23rd of Nisan in the year 5601, of the Hebrew calendar, which corresponds to 1841. And this is a letter to the Igbos. They are addressed as brothers, children of Israel," end quote. Now, let me say up front that I appreciate Rabbi DeMota posting this, as this was one of the last few pieces of the puzzle for me, regarding the Igbo Psaq that the Obadyah Alliance had put out in 2022. You see, claims have been made about letters which were sent from European rabbis to the Igbos, and I was unsure what texts precisely were being referred to. And I was not previously aware of this text, which Rabbi DeMota posted. So I was happy to be able to examine it, just yesterday. And that said, the first thing that needs to be pointed out is that the title of the source is right at the top of the page. It's somewhat cut off, but if you look closely, you can see that it clearly reads Israel's Odyssey in Deep Africa. Now, that's actually one of Remy Ilona's books. So Remy Ilona was perhaps exciting his fan base by telling them that Rabbi DeMota posted a letter from European rabbis to the Igbos, and he directs them to a post in which DeMota is showing a page from one of Remy's books, right? honestly, it feels a bit like we're moving in a circle once you realize that, right? It feels a bit like a self-reinforcing loop. But perhaps that's a minor point. Now, here's something that I feel is more significant. As you read through this text, it never mentions Igbos. You won't find a single reference to Igbos. There's nothing in it that indicates that it's addressed to specifically Igbos. And when you get to the end of the letter, it has a portion which reads as follows. Ha'ish ha'holech be'makomotchem ish tov hu. The man walking in your locations is a good man. Shemo Simpson. His name is Simpson. So looking at that, the first question should be, who is Simpson, right? Who's that referring to? And that's actually a reference to William Simpson. And the letter was reproduced in William Simpson's 1843 work, a private journal kept during the Niger expedition, which is available online. And I'll put a link to that in the video description. And in the introduction of that book, it's noted on page 10, and more specifically Roman numeral 10, it's noted that Simpson was given that letter in case he encountered any Jews in the interior of Africa. So to be clear, the letter never mentions Igbos, and it's a very generalized letter with a sort of to whom it may concern sort of tone, right? And yes, it's addressed to the children of Israel, but it's addressed to them in the abstract. And it was not focused on specifically Igbo territory, but rather the interior of Africa more broadly. Now, some might want to argue that it was given to him during an expedition along the Niger River, and Igbos lived along the Niger River. Therefore, it must have meant that, it must have been directed toward the Igbos. But the Niger River is a huge river, and Simpson's journey covered quite a few different places, including Sierra Leone, which is right near the source of the Niger River, and it was also in the part of the Niger River that cuts through Benin. And then aside from that, he also explored Accra. He also at least stopped by Accra, which admittedly is quite far from the Niger River. So the claim that the letter was to specifically Igbos, it doesn't seem to have any merit, And again, the letter doesn't ever mention Igbos, as it was given to an explorer going to various parts of West Africa, just in case he encountered Jews, right? Just in case. But that said, let's jump ahead to a little bit after the 8-minute mark of Remy Ilona's video, at which point Remy makes clear that this video was intended as a sort of response to a video which the Yap Gang had made, critiquing some of Remy's claims, right? So let's check this out, and fair use.
It was brought to my attention yesterday that some people who came to me for help, they needed information about the Israelites so that they would better know who they themselves were. Apparently, they saw some conversations I had where I stressed that the great Yoruba people of Nigeria are not Israelites, they are not Jews, they are not Hebrews. And they were offended by that.
Okay, so just to be clear, Remy is referring to a Yap Gang panel discussion which aired on the Genesis 49ers channel with the title, Teaching Remy Ilona the Bioancestry of Yoruba, Yap Gang Corporal Punishment. And they had that discussion because Remy had been arguing that Igbos are Israelites and Yorubas are not Israelites, right? And so the discussion largely focused on how Remy's methodology for arriving at these kind of conclusions seems incoherent, right? And the video, or the critique, the panel discussion also delved into the genetic similarities between Igbos and Yoruba, right? And it's actually a really good discussion. I recommend it, as, Yap Gang panel discussions typically are very entertaining and informative. And of course, I'll link to it in the video description, right? I list all the sources used here in the video description, and I do that with pretty much all my videos. Now, before I return to Remy's video, I ask that you note that the Yap Gang had one of his books. It's titled Igbo and Abraham's DNA, right? They had that book on the screen, right? So just keep that in mind, that they had one of Remy's books on, titled Igbo and Abraham's DNA. They had it on the screen of their discussion because that's going to be relevant in a little while. But with that in mind, hopefully we keep that in mind. Let's return to the video. And again, fair use.
Because they were forced by a certain culture that is Pan-Africanist in outlook, that tends to see all Africans as one. So, because of that, and because of the fact that they did not grow up in the continent of Africa, to know that the differences between the Yoruba and the Igbo are more than the differences between the Igbo and the Japanese in everything.
Did you hear that? He said, and I quote, "The differences between the Yoruba and the Igbo are more than the differences between the Igbo and the Japanese in everything." And he said that in response to a panel discussion on genetics. So Remy there was implying that Igbos are genetically closer to Japanese than they are to Yoruba. To say that I'm skeptical would be a huge understatement, right? But of course, if Remy would like to substantiate that, he's definitely invited to do so. Though I must confess, I'm not confident that he ever will. But I digress. Let's return to the video, and again, fair use.
So they tend to look at everybody that is dark-hued as Israelites. And they do a lot of disservice to innocent peoples because this is colonialist in thinking. And they are egged on by what I would simply call the EB1A, EB1B tropes about genocide. About genotypes. This has led them to inventing things like Bantu genotype and all other things that I have not taken time to examine, since I know they have nothing to contribute as far as looking at ancestral history is concerned.
Okay, so in that clip, Remy made very clear that he's not familiar with the topic of Y chromosomal DNA. And, that he didn't even see a need to look into Y chromosomal DNA as he considers it largely irrelevant. And I want to point that out because the Igbo Psaq made an allusion to the Y DNA of Igbos being relevant to the claim that they're Israelites. And when the Obadyah Alliance was asked what studies or what sources were behind that statement, they, or perhaps more specifically Elazar-DeMota, directed those who were interested to one of Remy's books. But now we see that Remy himself has made very clear that he doesn't really know much about Y DNA. Now, as a disclaimer, I want to make clear that I'm not trying to cast aspersions on the Obadyah Alliance. I actually have a very positive view of Elazar-DeMota, whom I find to be a scholar and a gentleman and all around, just an impressive individual. However, if the rabbi will permit one academic objection, at this point, I fear that his Psaq may have relied too heavily on Remy Ilona, whose arguments don't seem to be built on the firmest foundations, right? That's my honest academic objection. I think there is a legitimate and fair question about the level of influence that Remy Ilona may have had on the Igbo Psaq. But having said that, let's now once again return to the video. And as you listen to this next portion, note how Ilona is now trying to distance himself from DNA. And note what he proposes as the alternative. Fair use.
If you want to know where a group of people came from, look at their culture and history. Stay very, very far away from genotype. If you want to know the ancestry of any group, look at history and culture. Stay very, very far away from genotype, from genetic studies.
If you want to know a people's ancestry, stay away from genetic studies. That's the advice of Remy Ilona. And it's ironic advice because note the title of his own video, right? Right there in the title, it says Abraham's DNA didn't change. His culture changed. And right there in his title, he's unwittingly stumbling upon the immediate objection to Ilona's appeal to culture, right? And that objection is that culture changes, right? You can be a direct descendant of a person and yet have major differences from that person culturally. Honestly, if I can share a personal anecdote, even in my own paternal line, there are dramatic religious, linguistic, and cultural shifts just 3 generations in a row, right? Because my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather were born and raised on entirely different continents, right? My father was born in the United States, his father was born in the Philippines, and his father was born in North Africa, right? 3 different continents, and as a result, 3 different languages as a result of who their mothers were. And of course, that also comes with cultural differences and even culinary differences and differences in taste and so on, and differences in ideology or religion. But yeah, that's a discussion for another time. The point is, culture can change dramatically very quickly, and therefore culture does not reveal lineage. In America, you have people from drastically different lineages sharing a common culture, right? And it's like that in any other modern nation that numbers in the millions, right? But Remy Ilona now wants you to stay very, very far away from genetic studies, right? That's what he said. Some of you have seen this before, and I'm pretty confident that you can think of other examples of this, where a certain Israelite claimant will appeal to DNA at one point, but then later try to advise people against making recourse to DNA. And they do that when they find that it might have implications contrary to their presuppositions. And this isn't even an appeal to DNA which casts doubt on, Remy's own claim of being an Israelite. Rather, it seems what's bothering Remy is the possibility that by such standards, a people he might not have the most positive view of might also be in the Israelite sweepstakes. And honestly, one is tempted to think that perhaps a local rivalry, a local ethnic beef, is serving as the lens through which Remy Ilona assesses this question. If genetic studies point to genetic similarities between Igbos and Yoruba, then Remy Ilona advises you to cast aside the DNA. Ignore it. Don't even look at it. But with that, let's yet again return to the video and note that in this next clip, the objection that Remy makes against the Yap Gang's critique, right? Fair use.
But these fellows that were angered by my submissions about the Yorubas base everything on genotype. Unfortunately, they had not read this. I ventured into genetic studies simply to demonstrate that the Igbo genes match genes in the Levant.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I don't want to say this disrespectfully, but honestly, I feel like that was an attempt at a bluff without actually watching the video he was objecting to. As I noted a short while ago, the Yap Gang literally showed Remy's book during the discussion, right? They literally had a copy of his book on the screen, and they even get into some of the text of his book at the 1 hour and 20-minute mark of the video, right? And that wasn't even the first time they looked at Remy's book, right? You can also see them show the book in a video from 6 months ago titled Japanese Fridays. And of course, I'll link to that video as well in the description. And you can see the book come up at the 15-minute mark of that show, the Japanese Fridays one. And you can see it come up again, aside from the 15-minute mark, it comes up again at the 23-minute mark where Yeshua pulls up the book and goes through some of the text. And then before that, a couple months before that, in December of last year, the Yap Gang had a show which was fully dedicated to that book, right? It was a show titled Overview of Remy Ilona's book on DNA, Yap Gang Literacy, right? And in that show from December of last year, they devoted literally hours to reading through and commenting on Remy Ilona's book. So with all due respect to Remy Ilona, he is at best misinformed. And honestly, I'm tempted to say that at worst, one might wonder if Remy bore false witness there. But whatever the case, let's look at one final clip where Remy does attempt to address the apparent genetic similarities between Yoruba and Igbos. So take a look at this, and yet again, fair use.
Abraham's DNA remained essentially the same with the DNA of Terah, his father, Noah, his ancestor, and if his DNA did not change, why are you thinking that the DNA of all the peoples that came out of Abraham will change? The Ishmaelites came out of Abraham. The children of Isaac, who became the Israelites, came out of Abraham. So if you find genetic similarities between Ishmaelites and the children of Israel, does that mean that the Ishmaelites became Israelites? I'm posing these questions because some people who have not met Igbos are spreading the scandal, the rumor, that they found that Igbo DNA matches with the DNA of other Nigerians.
Okay, at first glance, he seems to be saying maybe Yorubas are Ishmaelites, so if their DNA is similar, that doesn't mean they're Israelites, right? It's to be expected. If Igbos are Israelites and Yorubas are Ishmaelites, then hey, well, what's the big deal about them having similar DNA, right? But he said something in passing which I think is significant, and what he said was that Abraham's DNA was essentially the same as that of Noah. And the reason why that's significant is because Remy is on record insinuating that Yorubas are not Semites at all, but rather Hamites, more specifically Canaanites. And this is where his flippant waving off of Y-DNA becomes relevant, because if both patrilineal Hamites and patrilineal Semites have E1B1A, that would immediately beg the question of what sort of flood model Remy Ilona holds to, right? The only way that that can make sense is if it's on a local flood model in which all of Noah's sons are E carriers, or perhaps more specifically, E1B1A carriers. So that would mean if you have R or G or J or whatever, you don't even descend from Noah, right? You're from a population that survived outside of a local flood zone, right? That would seem to be the implication there. Otherwise, on a global flood model, this isn't going to make sense. But maybe Remy's changed his position, and maybe now he holds that the Yoruba are Semites after all, but he'll say they're Ishmaelites. And with that in mind, I actually saw another guy claim that he thought Remy declared Yoruba to be Edomites, which, and either way, whether they're Ishmaelites or Edomites, that would mean that they're Hebrews after all. But lately Remy has been saying still that they're not Hebrews, right? But whatever Remy's position is, the question has to be, how is Remy Ilona reaching his conclusions, right? Does he have a coherent methodology, or is he just trying to exclude Yoruba from his model because of negative feelings rooted in historical conflicts, right? That's a legitimate question. And with that in mind, I want to close by making note of a curious feature of Rabbi-DeMota's Psaq Din on the Igbos, right? You see, the Hebrew edition of the Psaq Din contains certain details which aren't found in the English edition. Now, some of that, most of that actually, pertains to references to rabbinic sources, right? The way he alludes to rabbinic sources is different in the English version and the Hebrew version, right? And that's fair, because Hebrew readers might be more interested in the finer details of citing these rabbinic sources, right? Okay, fine. But that aside, towards the end of the Psaq Din, the Hebrew edition also has a portion which states the following: Ha-Igbo nirdafim al yadei shchenehim Fulani wa Yoruba. The Igbo were persecuted by their Fulani and Yoruba neighbors, right? And this line does not appear in the English edition. But the Hebrew edition uses that statement about Yoruba persecution to then argue that as a result, Igbos almost never mix with Goyim. And yes, it literally says Goyim, Gentiles, right? That's the last word at the left end of the underlined text on your screen, right? And I wanted to point that out in part because the differences between the Hebrew and English editions are interesting, but also because it once again raises a question about Remy Ilona's possible influences on that Psaq Din, right? That text seems to me to come very close to insinuating that Yorubas are Gentiles. And that can make sense on a halachic definition, but I still have to wonder if Rabbi-DeMota unwittingly included a bit of Remy Ilona's acrimony, rooted, this is acrimony that's rooted in historical conflict and trauma. And since the Psaq Din brought up the Y-DNA of Igbos, I think it's fair to ask this question: what Y chromosomal haplogroups are found among Igbo that are not found among Yoruba, right? If you can make a case for the Y-DNA of Igbos going back to Israel, what Y-DNA is that? And do the Yoruba have that Y-DNA, or do they lack it? That's a serious question in light of what's being brought up. It's a methodological question, and it's an important question. And it's also at the heart of the Yap Gang's critique of Remy Ilona, which Remy Ilona was attempting to sort of respond to. But on that note, I'll close this video here. As always, I welcome any comments, questions, or criticisms, right? I do not censor comments here, so objections are most welcome. So feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative, and God bless.